Hey guys, welcome to my Samoan language instruction on indirect questions, and we're also going to be talking about the concept or. But before that, I'd like you to pause the video at this point, write these vocabulary words down, and work on them in a timely manner. Okay, so moving on, a couple chapters back, we had this video 22, it is called Forming Questions, and it taught you how to use pay and po. In that video, their usage was only considered for direct questions. Okay, so in that video, we learned that if someone was asking in a direct question, we could put pay or po before it to indicate that a question is being asked. But oftentimes, this method is omitted in informal speech. What we do is we raise our intonation right before the end of the sentence, and then we lower it right at the end to indicate to the person that we're talking to that we're asking a question. It's kind of like in English when you raise your intonation at the end, like, where are you going? We raise it, but in Samoan it's the opposite. But in this particular video, we're not going to be talking about direct questions like that video did. We're going to be talking about indirect questions. And so we're still going to be using pay and po, and pay and po may also be used in indicating indirect questions. So what exactly are indirect questions? We need to be able to know what that is before we can use pay and po in another way. Okay, so this paragraph right here helps me at least to know what an indirect question is if you're having any questions about that. So an indirect question is a sentence that talks about a question rather than asking one. The following are examples. So I really like examples, and here we go. So he asked me why I was still here. There's no question mark at the end of the sentence, so it's not a direct question. But there is a question being talked about. He was wondering, he had a question on why the person that he's stating was still there. Okay? So that there's a question being talked about in this sentence. She wanted to know what was going on. She had a question, what was going on, but it's not a direct question, it's just an indirect question. There's a question being implied, okay? They wondered where they should go, and we are curious whether you will stay. So hopefully these examples kind of show you what an indirect question is if you were having trouble before. So each of these examples has an implied question embedded in them. In Samoan, each implied question is preceded by pay and po. So, for example, in these sentences I have why, that's kind of a question word. What, that's a question word. Where and whether. These are all question words a lot of times that would start off questions. And in this case, it's not a direct question, but it's an indirect question. So before these underlined words, in Samoan, I would put a pay or a po before these to just indicate to who I'm talking to that there's an indirect question. There's a question being implied. And honestly, you'll see this form of pay and po more often in informal Samoan than you will in the direct case. Okay? And so these are very important to learn what they are. And you might have already seen these up until this point. You just didn't know exactly what was going on probably. So before these underlined words in these example sentences, because I'm implying a question here or a question's being implied, you would put a pay or po right there before those question words to indicate to whoever you're talking to there is an indirect question. So let's kind of move forward. So using the same rules found in video 22, forming questions we review. So you use the same rules, and the things that I put in blue are additional insights. Okay, so po and pay may begin Samoan questions. We talked about that in our last video, and that was direct questions. And this is a new one, so po and pay may indicate indirect questions. And this is probably something, like I said, you're going to see more often than the first one, the direct questions. And then po precedes the particle o, which can form po'o. This can be seen quite often. And it also can come before olo'o because of the particle o, but then that also contracts to po'o. So a lot of times when you see po before the particle o, it contracts to po'o. Okay? And then pay is used everywhere else, although pay and po may be used before the tense marker ua. So po can come before ua and pay can come before ua. And then pay can also be used before olea. So you'll see pay before that as well. So if you have any questions here, I encourage you to pause the video at this point and review these rules about po and pay. And they're the exact same with direct questions as they are with indirect. You have to know which parts of speech. Is there a particle o that it's preceding or not is usually going to be the thing that helps you. Okay, so here's some example sentences. So she wanted to know where the boy went. So again, I see like a question word right here, where, and before that where, I'm going to put a po or a pay. And in this case, my word for where is ophea, and in most cases when I have a particle o, I put a po before that, and that's true to this. And then you'll also see that po turn into this right here, and this turn into this, po. And so you'll see in the sentence, so she wanted to know, that we're kind of saying a direct statement right here. So sa ia fia loa, sa ia fia iloa is she wanted to know, and then my po fea is kind of like indicating the where here. It's indicating an indirect question. So po fea sa alu iai letama, where the boy went. Okay, so just remember I put a po or pay before these indirect questions, and a lot of times you can know where that is by the question word. Okay, so in this next one, I'll ask the girl why. This is kind of another question word. Why her mother hated me, and that implies an indirect question. There's no question mark at the end of the statement. So olea officiliatu iletene is I'll ask the girl, okay, and then the why is pe aisea. This is the why, okay. And then the next thing is my indirect question that follows the why. So why her mother hated me. So you could also say that as a question. If I just took why her mother hated me, you could see that that's an implied question. And that right here, the equivalent to that is pe aisia na ino ai lonatina yateao. Okay? So the next phrase is they don't know what that thing is. So what is, that's kind of another question word that you'll see. And so lato te le iloa, this is they don't know, the very first part of that sentence. They don't know. And then my what is kind of indicating an indirect question right here. So that's po'o o lea. So that whole thing that's underlined there is kind of like the English equivalent to what. And then you'll see lana mea is what is that thing. Okay? So there's some examples there. And then I want to know whether, that's kind of my question word again, you're coming to our house or house tonight. So this is implying another indirect question. And basically what I want you to know is this has an asterisk. So this pay right here, in this case, it has an asterisk. And that asterisk, pay and po, can sometimes be translated to whether. So in these other examples I had where, so I put a pay or a po before that where. And then in this example I had a why, so I put a pay in front of that why. And then in this one I had a what, so I put a po before that what. But in this case, my whether, I don't have a Samoan word for whether other than pay. So pay or po can, either one of the two can act as whether. And so in this case I don't need to add an additional word. So I don't want to know, so this is, I want to know, so is ote fia iloa is right here. And then my whether, all I have to do for that is just put a pay right there. So whether is pay right here. And then my indirect question is if you're coming to our house tonight, or something like that. So pe ete sao ilo mato fale na ne. Okay? So then in our final example, you'll see whether again. So this is another implied question. And also, again, I see pay. So tell me is ta'omai, and then the weather is pay, and then you like this book, pay ete fia fia lene tusi. So I hope that you're starting to get the hang of this. Basically, when I have an implied question, and if you need to remember, okay, what is an indirect question? Well, just remember that an indirect question is one that has a sentence that talks about a question rather than asking one, okay? And hopefully that helps you. And hopefully all of these examples that we've been going over have kind of shown you, okay, that makes sense. I know what an indirect question is. And then when I have a question word, something that starts off that indirect question, that's where I put the pay, okay? And I encourage you, if anything is not quite clicking, I encourage you to pause the video, rewind, and rewatch, okay? Moving on, so here's some other ways that we can translate po and pay in an indirect sense. So po and pay may also be translated as to see whether, so to see whether or to see if, okay? And so this is another way that I could translate this, and here's my English example. So touch/feel his head to see if there's a fever. It's in question if he has a fever or not. We don't know, so that is an indirect question. There's a question implied. We want to know whether he has a fever or not. And so this is an indirect question. We're not asking, hey, do you have a fever? But there is a question prevalent by saying, hey, let's see if he has a fever or not. There's still a question there. So that implies a question, and an implied question is an indirect question. Okay, so the way that the Samoan equivalent would be is tango ane ilona ulu. So that is touch his head, okay? And then to see if there's a fever, this whole thing, to see if kind of marks a indirect question. And so that whole thing can just be translated as po or pay. And so I say pay is to see if a fever exists, okay? And that's all I have to say. It'll sound a little funny, or it might look a little funny to you, but that's the way that they say. I'm just saying I have an indirect question that follows this pay, and that pay can often be translated to see whether or to see if, and this is one of those examples. Okay, so moving away from our indirect questions, I told you we're going to be talking about another principle, or, and or I don't have to have an indirect question. Sometimes there's an indirect question, but also I can use or in direct questions, and often you'll see that. And in the two examples that I give you, will be the case. So, do you want to go to the house or not? That is a direct question, and I basically just fill the or right here with a po or a pay. So, e te fia alu ile fale, so this is, do you want to go to the house or not, would be pe leai. This is or not, okay? So, basically, remember, po and pay can also act as or, okay? So there's three different ways po and pay can work that you've learned up to this point. It can mark direct questions, it can indicate indirect questions, and then it can also take the place of or, okay? And then our final example of or in this case is this thing a book or a notepad? And so you see, is this thing a book right here? O se tu si lane, and then or is po'o se api, and that's or a notepad, okay? So hopefully that is making sense to you. If not, I encourage you to rewatch the material. Okay, so this is review. The additional ways po and pay are used. So the first part is the indirect questions we were talking about, and this can sometimes mean whether or to see whether or to see if. And the second way, and if you want to, you can pause the video and read this, but the second way, it's another way to say or, okay? And I have additional example sentences at the bottom, and I encourage you to try to not look at the Samoan side and try to translate these sentences on the left into the ones that are on the right. And good luck, guys. Way to keep watching these videos. I know that if you continue that you're going to start to really catch a hold of this language. We're getting into some of the fun parts. So keep up the good work, and tofa soifua.